This presentation is about shelter in disaster and conflict. The photograph is from Nepal earthquake 2015 April. This presentation is giving you some foundational information and thoughts related to shelter in disaster and conflict. And much of the presentation is based on the IFRC's training manual on shelter. However, all the ideas are to be challenged and please feel free to question. What are the realities of shelter? When we look at the word shelter, it is not sufficient in most languages to define the depth and challenges of the sector. In some languages, such as Sinhala, Tamil, or Hindi, opposed to the word shelter, they use the concept of home, which has a different meaning and different value. The second aspect of the reality is right to shelter is not recognized under international humanitarian law or the international human rights law, but there is a right to adequate housing. But what do we mean by adequate is a big question and a challenge in humanitarian context. Therefore, the focus should be on providing adequate shelter, which should be defined by the needs of affected populations rather than the emergency or the shelter type. Here are some challenges to shelter. There is no mandated leading agency in the shelter sector as compared to other sectors. There are few leading agencies have shelter in their mandate. The IFRC, UNHCR, and Norwegian Refugee Council are few of the leading providers of shelter amongst humanitarian actors. In terms of the shelter financing, only 20% of the shelter needs are met in any humanitarian response. Objectives of shelter. It should be protection from climate and weather, security and personal and family safety, enhanced resistance to ill health and disease, support for family and community life, support elderly and people with disability, and overall, shelter should be promoting and protecting basic human dignity. When we implement shelter responses in humanitarian crises, we need to use and employ and engage communal coping strategies. We need to understand how people define their shelter. How do they manage their shelter? How can shelter reduce risks and vulnerabilities of people? And how do the new shelter implementation should minimize adverse impacts on local environment and economy? And also, it's very important to understand how shelter maximize household livelihood support and local economic activities. Overall, we need to understand shelter has links to food and nutrition, health, water and sanitation, hygiene, and protection. Also, long term reconstruction through encouraging sustainable livelihoods. In this light, shelter should be seen as a process, not only the provision of a product. When we look at this IFRC diagram, it's important to understand three different aspects. We need to understand how the affected population were managing their shelter before the emergency. And during the emergency, we need to understand what kind of materials we are providing. Are we providing cash support? How are we going to contract local labor? And how are we going to get affected populations to help themselves? And what kind of technical support are we going to provide to the affected population to develop their shelter? The third aspect is how are we going to use our shelter response beyond the emergency phase? How can it contribute to the long term sustainable development? Shelter processes also needs to consider adequate space. Different cultures, different communities have different value to their shelter and spaces, and how the, the shelter programs could protect people from hazards and risks, and how the community could access safe drinking water and adequate sanitation and washing facilities. One of the most important aspects about shelter is it's not individually delivered. We deliver shelter for families, for communities. Therefore, they live in the same location. So, healthcare, schools, social services, and livelihood opportunities becomes very important. And then comes issues such as cooking, heating, lighting, food storage, and safe refuse disposal. And also, how are we going to understand and appropriately respond to the cultural appropriateness of materials, design, and layout? Shelter programs should be informed by nature and scale of disaster or conflict, climatic conditions, local environment, and importantly, political and security situations and context, whether it's rural situation or an urban situation, and the ability of community to cope. And also, it's important when we are developing shelter programs to understand the host community, people who are affected secondarily by the disaster or conflict. We need to think about regulations, national law, local regulations, or lack of regulations. This could be an opportunity for the agencies and the local communities to push for regulations if they don't have any regulations. Immediate shelter responses should be informed through assessments. The key question in this process is to ask what are affected households doing themselves to meet their shelter needs and how can we assist them. When we look at the Sphere 2010 shelter checklist, it's very important and it has various different aspects to answer this question. And you can also adapt that checklist according to your disaster or the conflict situation. Also, some agencies, national as well as international agencies, are providing plastic sheeting and other materials as part of their shelter programming. But that's not shelter programming, it is relief. So it's very much the idea that shelter should be linked to other sectors as well as long term sustainable livelihoods. When we think about implementing a shelter program, it should be informed by assessment, observation, and checking with households what they need. We could think about two different steps. The step one would be providing immediate and emergency shelter kits. The idea of this is to buy some time to develop a long term sustainable opportunities to develop safe, adequate, and durable shelter, which is the step two. In some cases, you don't have to implement the step one because there are opportunities and resources to implement step two directly. In terms of shelter, we also have to understand after a disaster or in a conflict situation, sometimes people are in transitional shelter or whether and how that transitional shelter could be translated into permanent housing. And also, we need to develop strategies to understand how shelter or housing as a livelihood vehicle, and how are we going to promote access to safe, adequate, and durable housing. And also, we need to think about settlement planning to reduce risks and vulnerabilities. Shelter can also be an opportunity to encourage community based risk reduction through safer housing and emergency shelter management. Finally, there is an opportunity for policy and advocacy on housing and land tenure issues in some places. Thank you very much.